By the 15th century BCE, Egypt stood at the center of a growing international world. The victories of the early New Kingdom had secured its borders and expanded its influence. Tribute flowed into the Nile Valley from distant lands. Foreign rulers corresponded with the pharaoh's court. Merchants traveled routes that connected Egypt to Africa, Levant, Mesopotamia, and the wider Mediterranean. The wealth generated by these connections transformed the kingdom. Monumental temples expanded across Egypt. Royal building projects reshaped cities and sacred landscapes. The authority of the pharaoh seemed stronger than it had been in centuries. Yet, one of the most remarkable rulers of this era was neither a conquering general nor a traditional king. She was Hatshepsut. Her reign remains one of the most fascinating chapters in Egyptian history, not because she was a woman ruling Egypt, though that was certainly unusual, but because she proved to be one of the most capable and successful monarchs the kingdom ever produced. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I and the wife of Thutmose II. When her husband died, the rightful heir, Thutmose III, was still a child. Initially, Hatshepsut served as regent, governing on behalf of the young king. Over time, however, her position evolved. Rather than remaining merely a caretaker of royal authority, she gradually assumed the full titles and responsibilities of kingship. This was an extraordinary development. Egyptian kingship was deeply rooted in tradition. The pharaoh was typically portrayed as a male ruler, fulfilling sacred duties established by centuries of custom. Hatshepsut therefore faced a unique challenge. She needed to exercise authority while fitting herself into an institution that had long been defined in masculine terms. And her solution was both practical and creative. Official monuments often depicted her wearing traditional royal regalia, including the ceremonial false beard associated with kingship. In inscriptions, she adopted many of the titles used by male pharaohs. But these choices were not attempts to conceal her identity. The Egyptians knew who she was. Rather, they reflected an effort to present her rule within the established framework of royal authority. For Hatshepsut, legitimacy mattered more than novelty. Her reign ultimately lasted more than 2 decades and brought Egypt considerable prosperity. Unlike some rulers who sought glory primarily through military conquest, Hatshepsut focused heavily on internal development, trade, religious patronage, and monumental construction. One of her most famous achievements involved an expedition to the distant land known as Punt. The exact location of Punt remains a subject of debate, though most researchers place it somewhere along the Red Sea coast of northeast Africa. To the Egyptians, Punt represented a source of valuable and exotic goods. Reliefs carved on the walls of Hatshepsut's mortuary temple provide detailed depictions of the expedition. The scene shows ships sailing across the sea, foreign settlements built on stilts, local rulers, and the exchange of goods between Egyptians and the inhabitants of Punt. The cargo returned to Egypt included incense, ebony, ivory, gold, animal skins, and living myrrh trees. These imports held both economic and religious significance to the Egyptian people. Incense played a central role in temple rituals. Precious materials enhanced royal prestige, and exotic products reinforced Egypt's image as a kingdom connected to distant and prosperous lands. The expedition demonstrated the sophistication of Egyptian trade networks. And although military campaigns often receive greater attention, commerce was equally important in sustaining Egypt's power. Trade brought wealth without the costs and risks associated with constant warfare. Hatshepsut also devoted substantial resources to construction. Her most celebrated monument is her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, located on the west bank of the Nile, opposite Thebes. Set against dramatic limestone cliffs, the structure remains one of the masterpieces of Egyptian architecture. Its terraces, colonnades, and carefully integrated design create a sense of harmony between the monument and the surrounding landscape. The temple served religious, ceremonial, and commemorative purposes. Reliefs within its walls celebrated Hatshepsut's achievements, including the expedition to Punt and narratives supporting the legitimacy of her rule. Elsewhere in Egypt, construction projects expanded temples, erected obelisks, and reinforced the prestige of both the monarchy and the gods. Among the greatest beneficiaries of this patronage was Amen. By this time, the god Amen had become the principal deity of Thebes and one of the most powerful figures in the Egyptian pantheon. His priesthood accumulated increasing wealth and influence as temple estates expanded. The relationship between crown and temple remained mutually beneficial. Royal patronage enriched religious institutions, while temples reinforced the sacred authority of the monarchy. After Hatshepsut's death, power passed fully into the hands of Thutmose III. If Hatshepsut's reign highlighted the benefits of trade and construction, Thutmose III's would become famous for military achievement. Few rulers in Egyptian history conducted more campaigns or expanded Egyptian influence more successfully. For this reason, some historians have described him as the Napoleon of Egypt, though such comparisons inevitably oversimplify the realities of ancient warfare. Thutmose III inherited an empire that was already prosperous and influential. His task was to preserve and strengthen it. One of his first major challenges came in the Levant. A coalition of local rulers rebelled against Egyptian authority, threatening the stability of territories that had been brought under control during earlier reigns. The resulting campaign culminated in the Battle of Megiddo. The battle remains one of the best documented military engagements of the ancient world, because Egyptian scribes recorded it in considerable detail. As Thutmose approached the city, he faced several possible routes through difficult terrain. His advisors recommended safer options. Instead, the king chose the most dangerous path, a narrow pass that offered the possibility of surprising his opponents. And his gamble succeeded. Egyptian forces emerged unexpectedly and gained a favorable position before the coalition could react effectively. The battle ended in a decisive Egyptian victory. The city itself endured a lengthy siege before ultimately surrendering. Megiddo became a defining moment in Thutmose's reign. It demonstrated his willingness to take calculated risks and reinforced Egyptian authority throughout the region. But the victory also carried broader implications. Local rulers throughout the Levant observed the outcome carefully. Rebellion had failed, and Egyptian military power remained formidable. Over the following years, Thutmose conducted numerous additional campaigns. Some aimed to suppress unrest, and others sought to secure trade routes or strengthen Egyptian influence. His armies advanced farther north than any previous Egyptian force. Egyptian inscriptions even boast of reaching the Euphrates River, one of the great waterways of Mesopotamia. Although Egyptian control over distant territories often depended upon local alliances rather than direct administration, the scope of influence achieved under Thutmose was unprecedented. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent. Maintaining such an empire required more than military success, however. Diplomacy played an increasingly important role. Foreign rulers sent tribute and gifts to Egypt. Ambassadors traveled between courts. Political relationships were carefully managed through negotiation as well as force. The international world of the late Bronze Age was becoming increasingly interconnected. Major powers monitored one another's activities, exchanged correspondence, and competed for influence across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Egypt stood among the most powerful of these states. The wealth generated by imperial expansion flowed back into the Nile Valley. Gold from Nubia filled royal treasuries. Foreign tribute supported building projects. Luxury goods enriched elite households. Temples accumulated resources through royal donations. The city of Thebes flourished during this period. As the religious heart of the kingdom, it benefited enormously from imperial prosperity. The Temple of Karnak expanded continuously. Successive rulers added pylons, courtyards, obelisks, statues, and sanctuaries. The result was one of the largest religious complexes ever constructed. Visitors approaching Karnak would have encountered towering monuments designed to inspire awe. The scale reflected both devotion and political authority. The gods were honored, but the monuments also communicated the wealth and capabilities of the state. For ordinary Egyptians, the benefits of imperial success were often indirect. Construction projects created employment. Trade increased economic activity. Military service offered opportunities for advancement. The expansion of administration created positions for officials and scribes. At the same time, empire required resources. Taxes supported campaigns and public works. Labor was mobilized for state projects. The benefits and burdens of imperial power were distributed unevenly throughout society. Despite these complexities, the reigns of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III are generally remembered as a golden age. Trade flourished, military power expanded, architecture reached new heights, diplomatic influence stretched across multiple regions. Egypt had become one of the dominant powers of the ancient world. Yet, prosperity often encourages confidence, and confidence can sometimes encourage experimentation. The rulers who followed Thutmose inherited a kingdom of extraordinary wealth and stability. Within that environment, one pharaoh would attempt something unprecedented. He would challenge long-established religious traditions, establish a new capital city, transform artistic conventions, and redirect the focus of Egyptian worship toward a single divine power. His name was Amenhotep IV, but history would remember him by another name, Akhenaten. By the middle of the 14th century BCE, Egypt stood at the height of its power. The empire stretched from Nubia in the south into the Levant in the north. Foreign rulers sent tribute to the pharaoh. Vast quantities of wealth flowed into the Nile Valley. Temples controlled enormous estates, and monumental construction projects continued to transform the landscape. The kingdom appeared stable and prosperous. Its political institutions were strong. Its military remained respected, and its religious traditions had evolved over centuries into a complex system that connected every level of Egyptian society. The gods were everywhere. Temples dominated major cities. Priests conducted rituals throughout the year. Festivals brought communities together. Sacred stories explained the origins of the world, the cycles of nature, and humanity's place within the cosmos. Among the many deities worshipped throughout Egypt, Amun occupied a particularly important position. The rise of Thebes during the New Kingdom had elevated Amun from a regional god to one of the most powerful figures in Egyptian religion. His temples accumulated immense wealth. His priesthood managed extensive lands and resources. And the Temple of Karnak grew into a vast religious complex, supported by royal patronage and imperial revenues. And so, few observers would have predicted that this system was about to face one of the greatest challenges in its history. The transformation began during the reign of Amenhotep IV. The son of Amenhotep III, he inherited a kingdom that was wealthy, secure, and internationally influential. His father had presided over one of the most prosperous periods in Egyptian history. Diplomacy flourished. Monumental construction reached impressive levels. The royal court enjoyed access to extraordinary resources. Yet, shortly after ascending the throne, Amenhotep IV began pursuing policies that differed sharply from those of his predecessors. At first, the changes appeared limited. He displayed increasing devotion to a deity known as Aten. The Aten had existed within Egyptian religion long before Amenhotep IV's reign. Traditionally, the term referred to the visible disk of the sun and represented one aspect of solar worship. Earlier kings had honored the Aten alongside many other gods. Amenhotep IV elevated the deity to unprecedented prominence. Monuments commissioned during the early years of his reign increasingly emphasized the Aten. New temples dedicated to the solar deity appeared. Traditional religious imagery began to shift. Over time, the changes became more dramatic. The king eventually adopted a new name, Akhenaten. The name is commonly translated as something similar to effective for the Aten or beneficial to the Aten. The change signaled a public commitment to a new religious vision. Exactly what Akhenaten believed remains the subject of scholarly debate. Some historians have described his movement as the world's first example of monotheism, the worship of a single god to the exclusion of all others. Others argue that the situation was more complicated. Evidence suggests that Akhenaten elevated the Aten above all other deities and actively suppressed traditional cults. But whether he denied the existence of other gods remains entirely uncertain. Most scholars today prefer a cautious interpretation. The religious system he promoted is often described as monolatry or henotheism, forms of worship that focus exclusively on one deity without necessarily rejecting the existence of others. Regardless of terminology, Akhenaten's policies represented a radical departure from traditional Egyptian religion. The implications extended far beyond theology. Religion and politics were deeply intertwined in Egypt. Temples controlled wealth, employed large numbers of people, and played important roles in administration. Priests held influence throughout society. By elevating the Aten and diminishing traditional cults, Akhenaten was reshaping the balance of power within the kingdom. The cult of Amun appears to have been a particular target. References to Amun were removed from monuments. Traditional temples lost royal support. Religious institutions that had accumulated wealth and authority over generations suddenly faced unprecedented restrictions. The changes affected not only priests, but also ordinary Egyptians. For centuries, people had worshipped a wide range of deities associated with local communities, professions, natural forces, and personal concerns. Gods such as Osiris, Isis, Hathor, Ptah, and Amun formed part of daily religious life. Akhenaten's reforms challenged these long-standing traditions. Perhaps the most visible symbol of the new order was the construction of an entirely new capital city. Located in Middle Egypt, the site is known today as Amarna. Akhenaten called it Akhenaten, meaning horizon of the Aten. The city was established on previously undeveloped land, rather than within an existing political or religious center. This choice appears deliberate. By creating a new capital, Akhenaten could distance himself from traditional institutions and build a city dedicated to his religious vision. Construction proceeded rapidly. Palaces, temples, administrative buildings, residences, and workshops appeared across the site. Officials relocated to the new capital. Artists, craftsmen, and laborers participated in the enormous undertaking. For a brief period, Akhenaten became the center of Egyptian political and religious life. The city's architecture reflected the new theology. Traditional temples often emphasized dark, enclosed sacred spaces where priests conducted rituals before hidden divine images. The Aten's temples were different. As a solar deity associated with visible sunlight, the Aten was worshipped in open-air spaces exposed directly to the sun. Religious imagery changed as well. One of the most striking developments of the Amarna period involved artistic style. For centuries, Egyptian art had followed highly standardized conventions. Royal figures were typically depicted in idealized forms that emphasized strength, authority, and divine perfection. Under Akhenaten, artists adopted a markedly different approach. Royal portraits became more naturalistic and sometimes highly unconventional. Akhenaten himself was portrayed with elongated features, narrow limbs, prominent hips, and distinctive facial characteristics. The reasons for these depictions remain debated. Some scholars have suggested medical explanations, though evidence remains inconclusive. Others interpret the imagery as symbolic, reflecting religious concepts rather than physical reality. Scenes of royal family life also became more common. Artworks depict Akhenaten, his queen Nefertiti, and their daughters interacting in relatively intimate settings. They eat together, embrace their children, and receive blessings from the Aten's rays. Such images differ noticeably from earlier royal art. They provide an unusually personal glimpse into the royal household, though they still served political and religious purposes. Nefertiti occupied a particularly prominent position. Her name means, "The Beautiful One has come," and she appears frequently in surviving artworks. In some depictions, she participates in rituals and activities traditionally associated with kingship itself. Her exact political role remains uncertain, but she was clearly one of the most influential figures of the period. Beyond Egypt's borders, however, problems were beginning to emerge. The empire created by earlier New Kingdom rulers required constant attention. Vassal states expected support. Rival powers monitored Egyptian activity. Diplomatic relationships demanded maintenance. The most important source of information regarding these challenges comes from a collection of documents known as the Amarna letters. Discovered at Akhenaten, these clay tablets preserved diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and foreign rulers. Written primarily in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the era, they reveal a world of alliances, rivalries, requests, and complaints. Many letters come from local rulers in the Levant who sought military assistance against rival or external threats. Their messages often convey frustration. They request troops, warn of unrest, and express concern about deteriorating security conditions. Historians continue to debate the extent to which Akhenaten neglected foreign affairs. Some argue that his focus on religious reform distracted him from imperial responsibilities. Others caution that the available evidence provides only a partial picture. What seems clear is that Egyptian influence in parts of the Levant weakened during his reign. Whether this decline resulted directly from Akhenaten's policies remains difficult to determine with certainty. By the later years of his rule, the future of the Atenist experiment appeared increasingly uncertain. The new religion depended heavily upon royal support. Traditional cults retained deep roots throughout Egyptian society. Many established institutions had lost influence, but not necessarily popular loyalty. When Akhenaten died, the system he created proved remarkably fragile. The succession that followed remains somewhat obscure. several short-lived rulers may have governed during the transition, and historians continue to debate the identities and roles of certain individuals. What is clear is that the religious revolution soon began to unravel. The young king who eventually assumed the throne was originally named Tutankhamun. His name reflected devotion to the Aten. Soon after taking power, however, a significant change occurred. The king adopted a new name, Tutankhamun. The alteration replaced the Aten with Amun, signaling a return to traditional religious practices. The capital at Akhenaten was abandoned. Royal patronage shifted back toward older temples. Traditional gods regained their place within Egyptian worship. The experiment that had reshaped Egypt for nearly 2 decades came to an end, and later generations went even further. Many monuments associated with Akhenaten were dismantled or altered. His name was omitted from some king lists. Successors sought to erase memories of what they viewed as an unacceptable departure from tradition. Yet, complete erasure proved impossible. Ruins remained, documents survived, artworks endured beneath sand and stone. Modern archaeology has allowed historians to reconstruct much of this remarkable episode. The Amarna period remains one of the most fascinating chapters in Egyptian history because it reveals a society willing, however briefly, to challenge centuries of established tradition. But the revolution ultimately failed. Traditional religion returned. The empire survived. The temples reopened. Yet the questions raised by Akhenaten's reign continue to intrigue historians today. His successors would spend years restoring stability and repairing relationships strained during the upheaval. Among them was a young king whose tomb would become the most famous archaeological discovery in Egyptian history. His reign was brief. His impact during his lifetime was modest. Yet, thousands of years later, the name Tutankhamun would become known throughout the world. When Akhenaten died, Egypt found itself in an uncertain position. For nearly 2 decades, the kingdom had experienced one of the most dramatic religious transformations in its history. Traditional temples had lost royal support, ancient cults had been disrupted, and a new capital city had been constructed and then rapidly elevated to the center of political life. The institutions that had sustained Egyptian civilization for centuries remained intact. They required restoration. The task fell first to a young king whose name would one day become more famous than almost any other pharaoh, Tutankhamun. Despite his modern fame, Tutankhamun was not one of Egypt's greatest rulers. He did not conquer vast territories, commission colossal monuments on the scale of Ramesses II, or fundamentally reshape Egyptian society. And his reign lasted only about a decade, as he died at a young age. His historical importance lies largely in the period during which he ruled. Born during the Amarna era, Tutankhamun entered a world still shaped by Akhenaten's religious reforms. And soon after ascending the throne, a profound shift occurred. The royal court abandoned the religious policies of Akhenaten. Traditional worship was restored. Temples dedicated to long-standing gods reopened. Priests regained their positions. The royal residence moved away from Akhenaten. As part of this process, the young king's name changed from Tutankhamun to Tutankhamun. The alteration symbolized a broader return to Egypt's religious traditions. Official inscriptions from the period emphasize restoration. Temples damaged or neglected during the Amarna years received support. Sacred rituals resumed, and the old relationship between crown and priesthood was reestablished. Much of this work was likely directed by powerful advisors. Among the most important were Ai and Horemheb, experienced officials who would later play major roles in Egyptian politics. Tutankhamun himself died around 1323 BCE, probably while still in his late teens. The exact circumstances of his death remain uncertain. Over the years, numerous theories have been proposed, ranging from murder to accident to illness. Modern examinations of his remains suggest that health problems, injuries, and disease may all have contributed to his early death, though historians remain cautious about definitive conclusions. Had his tomb been discovered and robbed in antiquity like many others, Tutankhamun might be remembered only as a minor king. Instead, fate intervened. In 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter uncovered Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of Kings. And unlike most royal burials, it had survived largely intact. This discovery captivated the world. Inside were thousands of objects: furniture, chariots, weapons, jewelry, statues, clothing, ceremonial equipment, and the famous gold funerary mask that has become one of the most recognizable symbols of ancient Egypt. The tomb transformed public understanding of Egyptian civilization. It provided an unprecedented glimpse into royal life and funerary practices during the New Kingdom. Ironically, a relatively minor king became the most famous pharaoh in history. Following Tutankhamun's death, power passed briefly to Ai and then to Horemheb. Horemheb had served as a military commander and senior official. By the time he became king, Egypt still faced the lingering consequences of the Amarna period. He devoted considerable effort to restoring stability. Administrative reforms strengthened government institutions. Traditional religious practices received support. Efforts were made to erase memories of Akhenaten's revolution. Later Egyptian king lists often omitted the rulers associated with the Amarna period entirely, treating them as illegitimate interruptions in the proper order of kingship. This process reflected more than political convenience. For many Egyptians, the restoration of traditional religion represented the restoration of Maat itself, the sacred order upon which society depended. Horemheb died without a surviving heir, bringing the 18th dynasty to an end. The throne passed to a new family that would produce some of Egypt's most famous rulers. The 19th dynasty began with Ramesses I, but it was his successors who would elevate their dynasty to greatness. Among them was Seti I. Seti inherited a kingdom that remained powerful, but faced increasing challenges abroad. Rival states competed for influence in Syria and the Levant. Egypt's northern territories required constant attention. Seti responded with military campaigns designed to strengthen Egyptian authority and secure strategic regions. He achieved significant successes and restored Egyptian influence in areas that had become contested. Yet, his greatest contribution may have been the stable foundation he provided for his son. That son was Ramesses II. Few rulers in Egyptian history have left a larger mark on the landscape. Ramesses II, often called Ramesses the Great, ruled for approximately 66 years, one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history. By the time of his death, generations of Egyptians had known no other king. His reign became synonymous with royal power, monumental architecture, and military ambition. Ramesses understood the importance of image. Across Egypt, he commissioned statues, temples, inscriptions, and monuments celebrating his achievements. His name appears so frequently on surviving structures that modern visitors often encounter it repeatedly during tours of ancient sites. Some of these monuments were entirely his own creations. Others involved additions to older structures, ensuring that his presence became woven into Egypt's architectural heritage. Among his most famous building projects are the temples of Abu Simbel in Nubia. Carved directly into rock cliffs overlooking the Nile, these temples feature colossal seated statues of the king. Their scale remains astonishing. The larger temple was dedicated to major deities, including Amen, Ra-Horakhti, and Ptah, while simultaneously glorifying Ramesses himself. The site communicated power to all who traveled through the region. It demonstrated Egyptian authority over Nubia and reinforced the divine status of the king. Elsewhere, Ramesses expanded temples at Karnak and Luxor, constructed vast monuments throughout the kingdom, and established a new royal capital known as Pi-Ramesses in the eastern delta. His reign represented one of the high points of Egyptian monumental construction. Yet, Ramesses was not solely a builder. He was also a military ruler, operating within an increasingly competitive international environment. One of Egypt's greatest rivals was the Hittite Empire. Centered in Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, the Hittites had become one of the major powers of the Late Bronze Age. Their influence extended into Syria, bringing them into direct competition with Egypt. The resulting struggle culminated in one of the most famous battles of the ancient world, the Battle of Kadesh. Fought around 1274 BCE, near the Orontes River in modern Syria, Kadesh involved thousands of soldiers, numerous chariots, and two of the strongest states of the era. The battle is unusually well documented. Egyptian inscriptions provide detailed accounts of the campaign, though naturally they present events from the perspective of Ramesses and his court. According to these narratives, Egyptian forces advanced toward Kadesh, believing the Hittites remained far away. In reality, the Hittite army had positioned itself nearby and launched a surprise attack. The situation quickly became dangerous. Several Egyptian divisions became separated. Hittite chariots broke into parts of the Egyptian camp, and chaos spread across the battlefield. Ramesses later portrayed himself as personally saving the army through extraordinary courage and leadership. While these accounts undoubtedly contain elements of royal propaganda, modern historians generally agree that the battle was fiercely contested and that the outcome was far more ambiguous than Egyptian inscriptions suggest. Neither side achieved a decisive victory. Kadesh ultimately remained under Hittite influence, yet Egypt avoided a catastrophic defeat and retained much of its regional power. The significance of Kadesh extends beyond the battle itself. Years later, Egypt and the Hittite Empire negotiated what is often considered the earliest surviving international peace treaty. Copies of the agreement survive in both Egyptian and Hittite versions. The treaty established mutual obligations, promoted stability, and reduced the likelihood of any future conflict. It represents one of the most remarkable diplomatic achievements of the ancient world. The later years of Ramesses' reign were generally peaceful and prosperous. Trade continued, construction projects expanded, diplomatic relationships stabilized. Egypt remained one of the leading powers of the Eastern Mediterranean. Yet, beneath the surface, changes were beginning to unfold. The international system that had supported centuries of prosperity was becoming increasingly fragile. Major powers faced economic pressures. Trade networks experienced disruptions. Population movements affected multiple regions. New groups appeared along the frontiers of established kingdoms. Few contemporaries could have predicted how dramatically the ancient world was about to change. The reign of Ramesses II represented the last great flowering of Egyptian imperial competence. The monuments still rose toward the sky. The temples remained wealthy. The empire endured. Yet, the age of the great conquerors and builders was approaching its end. Across the eastern Mediterranean, forces were gathering that would soon shake nearly every major civilization of the Bronze Age. Egypt would survive the coming crisis, but many of its neighbors would not. During the reign of Ramesses II, the great powers of the ancient Near East appeared firmly established. Egypt controlled vast territories and commanded immense wealth. The Hittite Empire dominated much of Anatolia. Powerful kingdoms flourished in Mesopotamia. Merchant ships crossed the eastern Mediterranean, carrying goods between ports linked by diplomacy, trade, and shared economic interests. To those living in the 13th century BCE, this international system may have seemed enduring and secure. Yet beneath the surface, strains were beginning to accumulate. The late Bronze Age world was highly interconnected. Trade networks stretched across thousands of miles. Copper from Cyprus, tin from distant sources, timber from the Levant, grain from agricultural regions, and luxury goods from many lands moved through a web of relationships that linked kingdoms together. This interconnectedness created prosperity. It also created vulnerability. When disruptions occurred in one region, their effects could spread far beyond local borders. By the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, the eastern Mediterranean entered a period of crisis that would reshape the ancient world. Historians often refer to this transformation as the Bronze Age collapse. The term describes a broad pattern rather than a single event. Across multiple regions, kingdoms weakened or disappeared, trade networks contracted, cities were abandoned or destroyed, populations migrated, and long-established political systems broke apart. The causes remain the subject of extensive scholarly debate. No single explanation accounts for every development. Instead, most historians view the collapse as the result of multiple interacting factors. Environmental stress appears to have played an important role. Evidence from climate studies suggests that some regions experienced periods of drought and reduced agricultural productivity. In societies heavily dependent upon successful harvests, such conditions could create serious challenges. Food shortages often led to instability. Agricultural difficulties affected tax revenues, government resources, and public confidence. Communities facing scarcity became more vulnerable to unrest and migration. Earthquakes may also have contributed to the crisis in certain areas. Several important settlements show evidence of seismic damage, though the precise impact remains difficult to determine. Political tensions added further complications. The major powers of the Late Bronze Age competed for influence, resources, and territory. Military conflicts consumed resources and disrupted trade. Diplomatic relationships sometimes broke down under pressure. The interconnected nature of the system meant that problems rarely remained isolated. A disrupted trade route could affect industries hundreds of miles away. A failed harvest in one region could influence markets elsewhere. A weakened kingdom might encourage neighboring powers or migrating populations to seize opportunities. Among the most famous and mysterious elements of this period are the groups known today as the Sea Peoples. The term originates from Egyptian inscriptions that describe various groups arriving from across the sea and threatening established kingdoms. Who exactly these people were remains uncertain. The Sea Peoples were probably not a single unified nation. Instead, they appear to have consisted of multiple groups with different origins and identities. Some may have come from the Aegean world. Others may have originated in Anatolia or other parts of the eastern Mediterranean. Their movements seem to have been connected to the broader disruptions affecting the region. As political systems weakened and populations became displaced, migrations and raids increased. Entire communities may have been searching for new lands in which to settle. The effects were dramatic. The Hittite Empire, one of Egypt's greatest rivals, disappeared entirely. Its capital city, Hatshepsut, was abandoned. Many cities across the eastern Mediterranean suffered destruction or decline. Long-distance trade contracted sharply. Some regions entered periods from which they would take centuries to recover. Egypt faced these challenges during the reigns of several rulers, including Merneptah and later Ramesses III. Merneptah, the son and successor of Ramesses II, inherited a kingdom that remained powerful, but increasingly aware of external threats. His inscriptions describe military victories against groups entering Egypt's sphere of influence. One of these inscriptions contains the earliest known reference to a people called Israel, demonstrating how complex and dynamic the Levant had become during this period. The pressures confronting Egypt intensified during the 20th dynasty. The most significant ruler of this era was Ramesses III. In many respects, Ramesses III was the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom. He faced challenges unlike those encountered by earlier rulers. The issue was no longer simply maintaining an empire. The issue was survival. Egyptian records describe major invasions involving the Sea Peoples. According to these inscriptions, large populations moved toward Egypt by both land and sea. The threat appears to have been substantial. Unlike traditional military campaigns, these movements may have involved entire communities, including families and possessions, seeking new territories in which to settle. One of the most famous accounts appears on the walls of Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. The reliefs depict dramatic scenes of conflict. Egyptian soldiers confront invading forces. Warships engage in naval battles. Archers unleash volleys of arrows. Captives are presented before the king. As always, Egyptian royal inscriptions should be interpreted carefully. Their purpose was to glorify the ruler and emphasize divine favor. Even so, most historians agree that Egypt faced genuine and significant threats. Ramesses III appears to have organized an effective defense. Egyptian forces successfully repelled attacks by both land and sea. The naval engagement described at Medinet Habu is particularly notable. It stands among the earliest detailed depictions of naval warfare in world history. The Egyptian strategy seems to have involved drawing enemy ships into confined waters, where archers and supporting vessels could attack effectively. The victory preserved Egypt's independence. Unlike the Hittites and several other contemporary powers, Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse. And yet, survival did not mean escape from its consequences. The costs of defense were substantial. Military operations required resources. Economic disruptions affected trade. Agricultural challenges persisted. Maintaining the institutions of an empire became very difficult. Evidence from Ramesses III's reign provides valuable insight into these pressures. One particularly revealing episode involves the workers of Deir el-Medina. These skilled craftsmen were responsible for constructing and decorating royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Records indicate that at one point, food rations failed to arrive on time. The workers responded by stopping work and organizing what is often described as the first recorded labor strike in history. Their complaints were practical and immediate. They needed food to support themselves and their families. The strike demonstrates that even highly organized states could experience logistical difficulties during periods of stress. It also reminds us that large historical transformations affected ordinary people as well as kings and generals. Economic problems became increasingly visible. Inflation appears to have risen. Government resources came under strain. Corruption occasionally emerged within administrative systems. Tomb robberies became more common. Royal tombs that had once seemed secure proved vulnerable when economic conditions deteriorated. The growth of tomb robbery reflects broader social changes. The immense wealth buried with pharaohs attracted attention. Officials responsible for protecting these treasures sometimes became involved in the very crimes they were meant to prevent. Surviving legal records reveal investigations, interrogations, and trials related to such activities. These documents provide unusually detailed glimpses into everyday concerns during the later New Kingdom. The power of temple institutions also continued to grow. The priesthood of Amun accumulated enormous wealth through landholdings, donations, and religious revenues. At Karnak and elsewhere, simple administrations controlled extensive resources. This increasing concentration of wealth created new political realities. Pharaohs remained powerful, but they no longer monopolized authority to the same degree as earlier rulers. Religious institutions, military leaders, and regional officials all possessed growing influence. The balance that had supported New Kingdom imperial power was gradually shifting. By the end of the reign of Ramesses III, Egypt remained intact. Its temples still functioned, its monarchy survived, its cultural traditions endured, yet the empire had changed. Territories in the Levant became increasingly difficult to control. International trade was reduced compared to earlier centuries. The interconnected Bronze Age world that had flourished under rulers such as Thutmose III and Ramesses II no longer existed in the same form. The age of Egyptian empire was drawing toward its conclusion. The centuries ahead would witness political fragmentation, rival dynasties, powerful priesthoods, foreign influence, and the shifting centers of authority. Egypt would continue to survive. Its civilization remained resilient. But the unified and expansive kingdom of the New Kingdom would gradually give way to a more divided political landscape. The last great age of imperial Egypt had passed. A different chapter of Egyptian history was about to begin. One in which power would no longer rest securely in the hands of a single ruler. The victories of Ramesses III had preserved Egypt from the worst effects of the Bronze Age collapse, but they could not restore the world that had existed before it. The great international system of the late Bronze Age had fractured. Trade routes became less reliable. Foreign territories that had once supplied tribute and strategic depth were increasingly difficult to control. The immense wealth that had flowed into Egypt during the height of the New Kingdom began to diminish. The kingdom endured, but it was changing. As the 12th century BCE gave way to the 11th, the centralized authority that had characterized Egypt's imperial age gradually weakened. The process unfolded slowly, over generations rather than years. Temples continued their rituals, farmers cultivated their fields, officials maintained records, and life along the Nile carried on. Yet the balance of power within Egyptian society was shifting. Historians refer to the period that followed as the Third Intermediate Period, a span of centuries marked by political fragmentation, regional rivalries, and changing centers of authority. Like the first intermediate period many centuries earlier, it was not simply an age of collapse. Egypt remained culturally vibrant and economically active. Art continued to flourish, religious traditions endured, and communities adapted to new realities. What changed most significantly was the structure of political power. The decline of the new kingdom became increasingly apparent during the later years of the 20th dynasty. Successive rulers named Ramesses occupied the throne, but few possessed the authority or resources of Ramesses II or III. Royal power became more constrained. At the same time, the priesthood of Amun continued to grow stronger. The Temple of Karnak and its associated institutions controlled enormous estates, livestock, workshop, and labor forces. Over generations, donations from kings and wealthy individuals had transformed the cult of Amun into one of the largest economic powers in Egypt. The high priests who administered these resources wielded influence that sometimes rivaled that of the pharaoh himself. This concentration of power was particularly evident in Upper Egypt. Thebes remained the religious heart of the kingdom, and the authority of Amun's priesthood became increasingly intertwined with regional governance. By the end of the new kingdom, some priests exercised powers that extended far beyond religious duties. In practical terms, Egypt was becoming divided between different centers of authority. The king remained an important figure, but royal control was no longer absolute. Around 1070 BCE, the traditional date marking the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt entered a new political era. The 21st dynasty established its center in the delta city of Tanis. In theory, the rulers of Tanis governed all Egypt. In practice, authority was shared with powerful religious leaders in Thebes. This arrangement produced an unusual political landscape. Northern and southern Egypt were often administered by separate groups that cooperated, competed, or negotiated according to circumstance. The unity of the kingdom survived in cultural and religious terms, but political authority was decentralized. For ordinary Egyptians, these changes were often less dramatic than they might appear from a modern perspective. The annual flood still arrived, fields still produced crops, religious festivals continued, marriage, trade, inheritance, and local administration carried on much as before. Yet, the shifting political environment created opportunities for new groups to rise to prominence. One of the most significant developments involved populations of Libyan origin. For centuries, people from regions west of Egypt had interacted with the Nile Valley through trade, migration, and military service. Some settled permanently within Egyptian territory. Others served in the army and gradually became integrated into Egyptian society. By the Third Intermediate Period, many families of Libyan ancestry occupied important positions within local administration and within the military. Over time, some of these leaders accumulated substantial regional influence. This development culminated in the rise of the 22nd dynasty. Its founder, Shoshonek I, came from a family with Libyan roots that had become deeply integrated into Egyptian society. When Shoshonek became king around 945 BCE, he did not present himself as a foreign conqueror. He ruled as an Egyptian pharaoh. His inscriptions followed traditional forms. He supported temples. He embraced established religious practices. By this point, distinctions between native Egyptians and long-settled Libyan elites had become increasingly blurred. Shoshonek proved to be an energetic ruler. He sought to strengthen royal authority and expand Egyptian influence beyond the Nile Valley. Military campaigns into the Levant demonstrated that Egypt still possessed considerable capabilities when effectively organized. His reign is also noteworthy because it may intersect with events recorded in the Hebrew Bible. Many scholars identify Shoshonek I with the biblical figure Shishak, who is described as campaigning in the Levant during the 10th century BCE. While questions remain regarding specific details, the connection illustrates Egypt's continued involvement in regional affairs. Following Shoshonek, however, the familiar pattern of fragmentation re-emerged. Multiple dynasties often ruled simultaneously. Regional centers gained influence. The authority of individual kings varied considerably. Political power shifted between competing families and local rulers. The situation was complex enough that historians sometimes compare the political map of this era to a patchwork. Different regions acknowledged different authorities. Alliances changed over time. Royal titles did not always correspond to effective control. Yet, despite these divisions, Egyptian culture remained remarkably stable. Religious traditions continued largely uninterrupted. Temples remained active. Artistic styles preserved many long-standing conventions. The Egyptian language continued evolving while retaining strong connections to earlier forms. One of the most important religious developments of the period involved the role of women in the cult of Amun. A title known as the god's wife of Amun became increasingly significant. Women holding this office often possessed substantial influence, wealth, and prestige. Through religious authority, they played important roles in the political and ceremonial life of Thebes. The office became an important mechanism through which rival political factions sought legitimacy and influence. Meanwhile, Egypt's southern neighbor was undergoing important changes of its own. South of the First Cataract, in a region known as Kush, a powerful kingdom was developing. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia had a long history. Egyptian rulers had conquered portions of Nubia during the New Kingdom. Egyptian culture, religion, architecture, and administration had influenced local societies for centuries. Yet cultural influence rarely moves in only one direction. The people of Kush adopted many aspects of Egyptian civilization while preserving their own traditions and identities. Over time, the kingdom centered at Napata grew increasingly powerful. Its rulers embraced Egyptian religious practices with particular enthusiasm. Amun became a major deity within Kushite society. Monuments reflected Egyptian architectural styles. Royal ideology drew heavily upon Egyptian models. Ironically, as political fragmentation weakened Egypt itself, some of the strongest defenders of traditional Egyptian culture emerged beyond its southern border. The rise of Kush foreshadowed significant changes to come. Elsewhere, broader developments were reshaping the ancient world. The centuries following the Bronze Age collapse witnessed the emergence of new powers. The Phoenicians expanded maritime trade across the Mediterranean. The kingdoms of Israel and Judea developed in the Levant. Aramaean states appeared throughout Syria. Farther east, Assyria began its transformation into one of the most formidable empires in ancient history. Egypt remained important, but it no longer dominated the region as it had during the age of Thutmose III and Ramesses II. Its rulers found themselves reacting to developments beyond their borders rather than shaping them. Even so, Egypt's resilience remained remarkable. Many civilizations that flourished during the Bronze Age had disappeared entirely. The Hittite Empire was gone. Mycenaean palace societies had collapsed. Numerous cities had been abandoned. Egypt, by contrast, endured. Its political institutions changed. Its rulers came from diverse backgrounds. Its centers of power shifted. Yet the civilization itself survived. Temples still stood along the Nile. Priests still recited ancient hymns. Scribes still copied texts whose origins stretched back centuries. The memory of the pharaohs remained alive. The Third Intermediate Period was therefore not simply an age of decline. It was an era of adaptation. Egyptian civilization adjusted to new realities while preserving many of its oldest traditions. That resilience would soon face another test. To the south, the kings of Kush were growing stronger. To the east, Assyrians were building an empire unlike any the ancient Near East had yet seen. Before long, both powers would play decisive roles in Egypt's future. The fragmented kingdom was about to encounter new rulers, new conquerors, and a new age of imperial competition. By the 8th century BCE, Egypt remained one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. More than 2,000 years had passed since the first kings united the Nile Valley. The pyramids were already ancient monuments. The great rulers of the new kingdom belonged to a distant past. Yet temples still functioned, priests still performed rituals, and the rhythms of life along the Nile continued, which they had for generations. The kingdom had survived periods of prosperity and fragmentation, foreign influence and internal rivalry. Its institutions proved remarkably resilient. What Egypt lacked during much of the Third Intermediate Period was lasting political unity. Regional rulers continued to compete for influence. Dynasties rose and fell. Authority shifted between northern and southern centers. Powerful families governed local territories with varying degrees of independence. This fragmented landscape created opportunities for ambitious powers beyond Egypt's borders. And one of those powers emerged from the south. The kingdom of Kush, centered in Nubia, had grown steadily stronger over several centuries. Its rulers inherited a long history of interaction with Egypt. During the New Kingdom, Egyptian armies had occupied parts of Nubia. Egyptian religion, art, writing, and political traditions had left a deep impression on the region. Yet Kush was never simply a copy of Egypt. Its people developed their own identity, while selectively adopting Egyptian influences. By the 8th century BCE, Kushite rulers governed a prosperous and increasingly powerful kingdom. The city of Napata became an important political and religious center. The cult of Amun flourished there. Temples rose along the Nile. Kings embraced forms of royal ideology that would have been familiar to Egyptian observers. In some respects, the rulers of Kush became guardians of traditions that many Egyptians themselves associated with a glorious past. The figure who transformed this regional power into a force capable of reshaping Egyptian history was Pi, sometimes known as Pianki. During the 8th century BCE, Egypt remained divided among multiple rulers. Several dynasties claimed authority in different regions. Local kings competed for territory and influence. Political fragmentation limited the ability of any single ruler to dominate the entire Nile Valley. Pi saw an opportunity. From his base in Kush, he launched a campaign northward into Egypt. The details of this campaign survive through a remarkable inscription known as the Victory Stela of Pi. Unlike many royal inscriptions, it provides a relatively detailed narrative of events. Pi portrayed himself as a righteous ruler, restoring proper order to a divided land. He condemned rival leaders for failing to uphold religious obligations and presented his intervention as both a political and sacred mission. His armies advanced steadily through Egypt. City after city submitted or was conquered. Rival rulers acknowledged his authority. By the end of the campaign, Pi had effectively established Kushite dominance over Egypt. Rather than remaining permanently in the north, he eventually returned to Nubia. Yet the political transformation endured. His successors continued ruling Egypt, creating what historians call the 25th dynasty. The Kushite pharaohs governed as Egyptian kings. They adopted traditional royal titles. They sponsored temple construction. They honored Egyptian gods. They commissioned monuments that consciously evoked earlier periods of Egyptian history. Their reign represented one of the most fascinating episodes in Egypt's long history. Far from destroying Egyptian traditions, the Kushite rulers often sought to revive them. They restored temples, encouraged religious activity, and emphasized connections to earlier eras of pharaonic greatness. Among the most important rulers of this dynasty was Taharqa. Taharqa presided over extensive building projects and became one of the most prominent kings of the Kushite era. His monuments appeared throughout Egypt and Nubia. Temples received royal support, and religious institutions flourished. Yet, the Kushite pharaohs faced a challenge greater than any internal rival. Far to the northeast, a new imperial power was expanding rapidly: the Assyrian Empire. Originating in northern Mesopotamia, Assyria transformed itself during the first millennium BCE into one of the most formidable military states of the ancient world. Assyrian armies conquered vast territories stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Their rulers developed highly organized administrative systems, sophisticated military structures, and an imperial ideology centered on expansion and dominance. Unlike many earlier kingdoms, Assyria possessed both the ambition and the capability to project power across enormous distances. Eventually, its interests collided with those of Egypt. The Levant, long a region of strategic importance, became the primary zone of competition. As Assyria expanded westward, Egyptian rulers sought to maintain influence among local states and allies. Diplomatic maneuvering, military intervention, and shifting alliances characterized the relationship between the two powers. Conflict became increasingly likely. Under kings such as Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, Assyria launched campaigns against Egypt itself. These invasions represented a new kind of threat. Unlike earlier rival powers, Assyria possessed the resources to conduct large-scale military operations deep into Egyptian territory. In 671 BCE, Esarhaddon invaded Egypt and achieved a major victory. The Kushite ruler Taharqa retreated southward as Assyrian forces captured important cities. For the first time in centuries, Egypt faced conquest by a major foreign empire. The struggle did not end immediately, however. Taharqa and his successors attempted to regain lost territory. Rebellions and counterattacks continued. Assyrian armies repeatedly returned to suppress resistance. One of the most dramatic moments occurred during the reign of Ashurbanipal. His forces captured Thebes in 663 BCE. The city had served as one of Egypt's greatest religious centers for centuries. Its temples housed immense wealth, and its monuments embodied generations of Egyptian history. The fall of Thebes sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world. Although the city eventually recovered, the event symbolized the vulnerability of Egypt in an age dominated by larger imperial powers. The Assyrians did not rule Egypt directly for long. Instead, they supported local rulers who would govern on their behalf. One of these local leaders was Psamtik I. Psamtik belonged to a family based in the delta city of Sais. Initially supported by Assyria, he gradually consolidated power and asserted greater independence. As Assyrian influence weakened elsewhere, opportunities emerged. The empire that had conquered Egypt began facing difficulties of its own. Internal challenges and external threats strained its resources. Psamtik skillfully exploited these circumstances. By the middle of the 7th century BCE, he had reunited Egypt under native rule, inaugurating what historians call the 26th dynasty, or the Sayyid period. This era witnessed a remarkable revival. The rulers of Sais consciously looked back to earlier periods of Egyptian history. Artistic styles revived older traditions, religious institutions received support, and administrative reforms strengthened the kingdom. Historians sometimes describe this phenomenon as archaism. Ancient traditions were not merely preserved, they were actively celebrated and revived. The Sayyid rulers governed during an increasingly interconnected world. Greek merchants and mercenaries appeared in growing numbers within Egypt. Trade expanded across the Mediterranean. Foreign communities established themselves in Egyptian cities. Naucratis, a Greek trading settlement in the Delta, became an important center of cultural exchange. Egypt was no longer isolated. Ideas, goods, and people moved across regions with increasing frequency. The kingdom enjoyed a period of relative stability and prosperity. Yet, another great empire was rising. This time, it emerged from the Iranian plateau, the Persian Empire. Founded by Cyrus the Great and expanded by his successors, the Achaemenid Empire rapidly became the largest political entity the ancient world had yet seen. Persian armies captured Media, Lydia, Babylon, and numerous other territories. Eventually, Egypt attracted their attention. In 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II invaded Egypt. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Pelusium, fought near Egypt's eastern frontier. Ancient accounts of the battle include colorful stories involving sacred animals and psychological tactics, though historians remain cautious about accepting all such narratives as factual. What is certain is that the Persians achieved victory. Egypt became part of the Achaemenid Empire. The conquest marked another turning point. For centuries, Egypt had alternated between unity and fragmentation under largely indigenous dynasties. Now, it became one province within a vast multinational empire stretching across 3 continents. Persian rulers generally respected many aspects of Egyptian culture. Temples continued functioning, priests maintained rituals, local administration persisted. At the same time, ultimate authority rested elsewhere. Egyptian resources supported imperial objectives. Governors appointed by the Persian kings oversaw administration. Rebellions periodically challenged foreign rule. But resistance never disappeared entirely. Several Egyptian revolts temporarily restored native dynasties, demonstrating the continued strength of local identity and political aspirations. Yet the broader trend was clear. The age when Egypt stood as the dominant power of the Near East had long since passed. The Nile Valley remained wealthy and culturally influential, but it now existed within a world shaped by larger imperial systems. The centuries ahead would bring even greater changes. Greek influence continued growing, Mediterranean trade expanded, new ideas circulated across regions. Then, in the 4th century BCE, a young Macedonian king would arrive at Egypt's borders. His conquest would end Persian rule. It would also usher in one of the most transformative periods in Egyptian history. And his name was Alexander. By the 4th century BCE, Egypt had existed as a recognizable civilization for nearly 3,000 years. Dynasties had risen and fallen. Native rulers, Kushite pharaohs, Assyrian conquerors, and Persian kings had all governed the Nile Valley at various points in its history. Through each transformation, however, Egyptian culture endured. The temples still stood. Priests continued to perform rituals whose origin stretched back centuries. Farmers cultivated fields nourished by the Nile. Ancient religious traditions remained deeply woven into daily life. And yet, Egypt was no longer isolated within its own world. The Mediterranean was becoming quite interconnected. Merchants crossed seas and deserts with growing regularity. Soldiers served far from their homelands. Ideas moved alongside trade goods. Foreign communities established themselves in Egyptian cities. Among the most significant of these newcomers were the Greeks. Greek contact with Egypt wasn't entirely new. For centuries, merchants, travelers, and mercenaries from the Greek world had visited the Nile Valley. During the Sayyid period, Greek communities became more visible within Egypt itself. One of the most important centers of this interaction was Naucratis. Located in the western delta, Naucratis functioned as a Greek trading settlement and commercial hub. Merchants from various Greek city-states conducted business there, exchanging goods and establishing relationships with Egyptian authorities. The settlement became a place where cultures met. Greek traders encountered Egyptian religious traditions, artistic styles, and administrative systems. Egyptians gained greater exposure to Mediterranean commerce and foreign ideas. These exchanges influenced both societies. Greek travelers later described Egypt with fascination. Its monuments, antiquity, and religious practices seemed extraordinary to visitors from the Aegean world. Among the most famous of these visitors was Herodotus. Traveling during the 5th century BCE, Herodotus recorded observations about Egyptian customs, religion, geography, and history. Although modern historians do not accept every claim he made, his writings remain among the most important ancient sources describing Egypt during this era. He was deeply impressed by what he saw. To Greek observers, Egypt represented an ancient and venerable civilization whose origin stretched far beyond the memories of their own societies. As Greek influence expanded across the Mediterranean, Egypt increasingly found itself connected to broader political developments. The Persian Empire continued to dominate much of the Near East. Although Egypt occasionally rebelled and briefly regained independence, Persian authority remained a powerful reality. Then, during the late 4th century BCE, events unfolded that would reshape the ancient world. The catalyst was a young Macedonian king named Alexander. Known today as Alexander the Great, he inherited the Macedonian throne in 336 BCE, following the assassination of his father, Philip II. Within a remarkably short period, Alexander launched one of history's most successful military campaigns. His armies defeated the Persian Empire in a series of decisive victories. Province after province fell under his control. Cities surrendered, armies were defeated. A political order that had dominated much of the ancient world rapidly unraveled. In 332 BCE, Alexander entered Egypt. Unlike some regions of the Persian Empire, Egypt offered relatively little resistance. Persian authority had become unpopular in many areas, and Alexander was often welcomed as a liberator rather than viewed solely as a foreign conqueror. The Egyptians had experienced periods of Persian rule before. To many, the arrival of a new ruler represented an opportunity for change. Alexander appears to have understood the importance of respecting local traditions. Rather than attempting to replace Egyptian customs, he embraced aspects of Pharaonic kingship. He participated in traditional ceremonies and was recognized as a legitimate ruler within the framework of Egyptian political culture. One episode from his Egyptian journey became especially famous. Alexander traveled westward into the desert to visit the Oracle of Amun at the oasis of Siwa. The exact details of what occurred remain uncertain. Ancient sources provide varying accounts, and later traditions often added layers of legend. What seems clear is that the visit held considerable symbolic significance. The oracle associated Alexander with divine favor and strengthened his legitimacy in the eyes of both Egyptians and his own followers. During his brief time in Egypt, Alexander made another decision whose consequences would endure for centuries. Near the Mediterranean coast, he selected the site for a new city. That city would become Alexandria. Its location was carefully chosen. Positioned between the Mediterranean Sea and the Nile Delta, Alexandria possessed access to maritime trade routes while remaining connected to the agricultural wealth of Egypt. Construction began during Alexander's lifetime, though he would never see the city completed. In fact, he would spend very little time in Egypt at all. Soon after founding Alexandria, he continued eastward to pursue further conquests. Within a few years, his empire stretched from Greece to India. Yet the vast empire he created proved difficult to sustain. In 323 BCE, Alexander died unexpectedly in Babylon at the age of 32. His death triggered one of the most significant succession crises in ancient history. Alexander left behind no universally accepted adult heir. His generals, known collectively as the Diadochi, competed for control of different regions of the empire. The struggle lasted for decades. Wars erupted across the former Macedonian domains. Alliances shifted repeatedly. Ambitious commanders sought to establish their own kingdoms. In Egypt, power eventually fell to one of Alexander's most capable generals. His name was Ptolemy. Ptolemy had served as a trusted companion of Alexander and possessed both military skill and political acumen. Recognizing Egypt's wealth and strategic advantages, he secured control of the region and established himself as its ruler. The dynasty he founded would govern Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Historians know these rulers as the Ptolemies. Their reign marked the beginning of a new chapter in Egyptian history. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks ruling an overwhelmingly Egyptian population. This created both opportunities and challenges. To govern effectively, they needed to balance multiple traditions. On one hand, they maintained strong connections to Greek culture. Greek became the language of administration and elite society. Greek institutions played important roles within government. On the other hand, the Ptolemies recognized the importance of Egyptian traditions. They adopted pharaonic titles. They supported temples. They participated in religious ceremonies. Monumental inscriptions portrayed them as traditional Egyptian kings. This blending of cultures became one of the defining characteristics of Ptolemaic Egypt. Greek and Egyptian influences interacted in complex ways. Sometimes they remained distinct, and at other times they merged, Religious syncretism, the blending of different religious traditions, became increasingly common. One notable example involved the creation of the deity Serapis. This god combined elements of Egyptian and Greek religious traditions and served as a symbol of cultural integration within the kingdom. Alexandria quickly emerged as the center of this new world. The city grew into one of the largest and most influential urban centers in the Mediterranean. Its harbors attracted merchants from across the world, its streets filled with people of diverse backgrounds. Its markets offered goods from Africa, Asia, and Europe. The city reflected the increasingly cosmopolitan nature of the Hellenistic age. Perhaps no institution better symbolized Alexandria's intellectual ambitions than its famous library. Supported by the Ptolemaic rulers, the Library of Alexandria sought to collect knowledge on an unprecedented scale. Scholars gathered texts from across the Mediterranean and Near East. Works of literature, science, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and history filled its collections. Although many details regarding the library remain uncertain, its reputation became legendary. Associated with the library was the Moseon, a research institution that attracted some of the greatest scholars of the ancient world. There, intellectuals studied astronomy, geography, mathematics, literature, and numerous other subjects. The city became one of humanity's foremost centers of learning. Yet, despite these transformations, Egypt itself remained recognizable, as it had done for thousands of years. The Nile still flooded, farmers still cultivated their fields, temples still welcomed worshippers. Ancient traditions endured alongside new influences. The Ptolemaic rulers governed a kingdom that was simultaneously Egyptian and Greek. This cultural blending created a society unlike any that had existed before. It also positioned Egypt at the center of Mediterranean politics. As centuries passed, however, yet another power was rising in the West. The Roman Republic expanded steadily across the Mediterranean. Its armies conquered rivals, its influence grew, and its political leaders increasingly viewed Egypt's wealth as strategically vital. The relationship between Rome and Egypt would become one of the defining stories of the ancient world. At its center would stand the final ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a queen whose name would become famous across continents and centuries: Cleopatra. As the Pharaonic line of Ptolemies was nearing its end, the kingdom became increasingly entangled in Mediterranean power politics. Of these external developments, the most important was the rise of Rome. Originally one state among many in the Mediterranean, Rome expanded steadily through military conquest and political influence. By the 2nd century BCE, it had become the dominant power in much of the region. Kingdom after kingdom fell under Roman influence or direct control, and the Ptolemies could not ignore this reality. Egyptian rulers relied upon diplomacy to maintain independence. Roman politicians became involved in Egyptian affairs. Alliances formed and dissolved. Internal disputes sometimes invited foreign intervention. The kingdom's fate became tied to the ambitions of leaders far beyond the Nile Valley. This process reached its climax during the reign of Cleopatra VII. Born in 69 BCE, Cleopatra inherited a kingdom facing immense challenges. The dynasty remained wealthy, but its power had declined. Rome dominated Mediterranean politics. Internal tensions still persisted, and rival claimants contested authority. But Cleopatra proved to be an exceptionally capable ruler. Unlike many of her predecessors, she learned the Egyptian language. Most Ptolemaic rulers had spoken Greek as their primary language, and often relied upon interpreters when dealing with Egyptian subjects. Cleopatra embraced both sides of her kingdom's identity. Ancient sources emphasize her intelligence, education, and her political skill. She understood that Egypt's survival depended upon navigating Rome's increasingly powerful political world. One of the most famous episodes of her reign involved her relationship with Julius Caesar. During a succession dispute, Cleopatra aligned herself with Caesar, whose military and political influence helped secure her position. Their relationship produced both political benefits and a son known as Caesarion. Following Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra faced new challenges. The Roman world descended into another period of civil conflict. Among the emerging leaders was Mark Antony. Cleopatra formed a political and personal alliance with Antony that would shape the final years of Ptolemaic Egypt. Together, they sought to preserve their power in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. Their chief rival was Octavian, the future Augustus. The struggle culminated in the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Fought primarily as a naval engagement off the coast of Greece, the battle ended in victory for Octavian's forces. The consequences were enormous. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt, where their position rapidly deteriorated. The following year, Roman forces entered Alexandria. Facing defeat, Antony and Cleopatra both died. Their deaths marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty. More significantly, they marked the end of independent Pharaonic rule. Egypt became a province of the Roman state. A line of kings stretching back through the Ptolemies, Alexander, the Persians, the Cushites, and ultimately to the earliest dynasties had come to an end. But the ancient civilization of Egypt did not disappear overnight. Its temples still stood. Its priests continued their rituals. Its people continued living along the Nile. Yet a profound transition had occurred. The kingdom that had once dominated the ancient Near East was now governed from afar. The age of Pharaohs was over. A new era, shaped by Roman power, was about to begin. For the first time since the unification of the Nile Valley, more than 3,000 years earlier, Egypt was no longer ruled by a pharaoh or a native dynasty. Its fate became tied to a vast empire centered far beyond the Nile. Yet, this transition was not as abrupt as it may appear. To many Egyptians, daily life carried on much as it had before. The Roman conquest marked the end of one political era, but it did not immediately erase the civilization that had developed along the Nile over millennia. Instead, Egypt entered a long period of transformation. Under Roman rule, Egypt occupied a unique position within the empire. Its agricultural wealth made it enormously valuable. The fertile lands of the Nile Valley produced vast quantities of grain, and Rome depended heavily upon these harvests. By the 1st century CE, Egyptian grain shipments helped feed hundreds of thousands of people throughout the Mediterranean world, particularly in the city of Rome itself. Control of Egypt therefore held strategic importance. The Roman emperors treated the province differently from many others. Rather than allowing senators to govern Egypt, emperors appointed trusted officials directly. This arrangement reflected the province's economic significance and helped ensure that its resources remained under imperial control. The administrative machinery of government expanded further. Taxation became increasingly systematic. Officials monitored agricultural production with great care. The Nile's annual floods remained a matter of state concern, just as they had been under the pharaohs. Records were kept regarding water levels, harvest yields, and taxation obligations. The bureaucracy that managed Egypt grew extensive. Fortunately for historians, many of its documents survived. Egypt's dry climate preserved papyri that would have decayed elsewhere. These texts provide extraordinary insight into life under Roman rule. Letters, contracts, tax records, legal disputes, business agreements, and personal correspondence allow modern scholars to glimpse the experiences of ordinary people with unusual clarity. Through these documents, ancient Egyptians became more than names carved into monuments. We encounter farmers negotiating leases, merchants arranging deliveries, soldiers riding home, and families managing inheritance disputes. Life among the Nile remained remarkably active. The Roman period witnessed continued urban growth. Alexandria remained one of the largest cities in the Mediterranean. Its population included Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Romans, and many others. The city continued to serve as a major center of commerce, scholarship, and administration. Its harbors bustled with activity. Ships carried grain northward to Rome and returned with goods from across the empire. Merchants, travelers, and officials moved through its streets in large numbers. Alexandria retained much of the cosmopolitan character it had developed under the Ptolemies. Yet, Roman Egypt was not simply a continuation of the Hellenistic world. New influences entered society. Roman law shaped administration. Imperial cults honored the emperor. Military garrisons maintained order and protected strategic locations. At the same time, older traditions remained resilient. Egyptian religion continued to flourish during the early centuries of Roman rule. The temples of ancient gods remained active. Priests maintained rituals whose origin stretched back thousands of years. Offerings continued to be made to deities such as Amun, Isis, Horus, and Hathor. Pilgrims visited sacred sites. Festivals attracted worshippers from surrounding communities. The worship of Isis became especially influential. Originally an Egyptian goddess associated with motherhood, protection, and magic, Isis gained followers throughout the Roman world. Temples dedicated to her appeared far beyond Egypt itself. From Greece to Italy and beyond, people participated in cults inspired by Egyptian religious traditions. In this way, aspects of Egyptian culture achieved a wider reach than ever before. The influence of Egypt extended across much of the Mediterranean. Art, architecture, religious symbolism, and philosophical ideas circulated among diverse populations. Even Roman emperors occasionally embraced Egyptian imagery and associations. Yet beneath this apparent continuity, deeper changes were underway. Languages evolved. The ancient Egyptian language had already undergone centuries of development. By the Roman period, many administrative and elite activities were conducted exclusively in Greek. Greek remained the dominant language of government, commerce, and intellectual life in many urban centers. Egyptian continued to survive among local populations, but it increasingly appeared in a later script known as Demotic. Over time, another form of writing emerged. This script, known as Coptic, adapted the Greek alphabet to represent the Egyptian language more fully. Coptic would become the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language and remains important today within the liturgical traditions of the Egyptian Christian community. The appearance of Coptic reflects broader cultural transitions occurring across the province. Perhaps the most significant transformation involved religion. The Roman empires of the 1st century CE witnessed the spread of new religious movements. Among them was Christianity. Christian communities appeared in Egypt relatively early. Ancient tradition associates the arrival of Christianity in Alexandria with the 1st century CE, though historians continue to debate the specific details. What is clear is that Christianity gained followers steadily over time. At first, Christians represented a minority. Traditional Egyptian religion remained active. Greek religious traditions continued. Various philosophical schools flourished. The religious landscape was diverse and complex. Over the following centuries, however, Christianity expanded dramatically. Its growth altered Egyptian society in profound ways. By the 3rd and 4th century CE, Christian communities had become quite influential. Egypt also played an important role in the development of Christian monasticism. Individuals seeking spiritual devotion withdrew into deserts and remote regions, establishing communities dedicated to prayer and ascetic living. Figures such as Anthony the Great became central to the history of Christian monastic traditions. The deserts that had once bordered the world of the Pharaohs now hosted a new religious movement. As Christianity expanded, traditional Egyptian religion gradually declined, and the conversion of Emperor Constantine the Great during the 4th century accelerated these developments. Christian institutions gained support. Traditional religious practices faced growing restrictions. Over time, temple revenues diminished. Priestly lineages weakened. Ancient cults lost followers. One of the most symbolic aspects of this transformation involved writing. For thousands of years, Egyptian priests had preserved sacred knowledge through hieroglyphic inscriptions. The ability to read and write hieroglyphs required extensive training. As temple institutions declined, fewer individuals acquired these skills. Knowledge that had once been transmitted from generation to generation faded. The process was slow but relentless. By the late Roman period, very few people remained capable of reading hieroglyphic texts. The ancient script that had recorded the deeds of pharaohs, religious hymns, administrative records, and funerary inscriptions for millennia approached extinction. One of the last known hieroglyphic inscriptions was carved at the Temple of Isis on the island of Philae. The inscription dates to 394 CE. By then, the world that had created hieroglyphs was disappearing. The temples themselves survived physically, but many no longer served their original functions. Religious traditions that had shaped Egyptian civilization since the earliest dynasties were coming to an end. The closure of the temples occurred gradually. Imperial decrees restricted traditional religious practices. Resources declined. Priestly communities dissolved. Eventually, the continuous chain connecting Roman Egypt to the earliest pharaohs was broken. The disappearance of hieroglyphic literacy carried enormous consequences. The monuments remained visible. Pyramids still stood above the desert. Temple walls still remained covered with inscriptions. Obelisks continued to rise toward the sky. And yet, the ability to understand those texts had been lost. Future generations could admire the monuments, but no longer read the stories they contained. Ancient Egypt became increasingly mysterious. Its language faded from memory. Its history became obscured. Legends replaced knowledge. Travelers gazed upon colossal statues without knowing the names of the rulers they represented. The civilization that had once dominated the Nile Valley entered a new phase of existence. It was no longer a living tradition. It had become a lost world. Yet lost did not mean forever forgotten. The monuments endured. The sands preserved tombs, temples, and inscriptions. Documents survived in hidden chambers and buried ruins. Centuries later, scholars, explorers, and archaeologists would begin the long process of recovering the past. The language of the pharaohs would eventually be re-deciphered. The stories carved into the stone would be read once more. The lost world of ancient Egypt was not gone. It was waiting to be rediscovered. As the sun set on the civilization of the pharaohs, the monuments remained. The pyramids continued to rise above the desert plateau at Giza. Temples stood along the Nile, their walls covered with inscriptions carved by hands long since turned to dust. Colossal statues watched over landscapes that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, empires, and religions. The civilization that created these monuments eventually disappeared as a living tradition. Its language faded from everyday use. Its temples closed. Its priesthoods vanished. Its kings became figures of distant memory. And yet, ancient Egypt never truly left the human story. Few civilizations have exerted such a lasting influence across so many centuries. Its achievements in architecture, administration, religion, art, engineering, agriculture, and writing continued to shape the world long after the final pharaohs had passed into history. Part of that influence can be seen in the very idea of the state. Ancient Egypt was among the earliest societies to develop a large, centralized government capable of managing vast territories, populations. Its rulers oversaw taxation systems, agricultural administration, labor organization, record keeping, legal processes, and diplomatic relationships on a scale that was remarkable for its time. Many of the practical challenges faced by Egyptian administrators, resource management, infrastructure maintenance, communication across large distances, and coordination of labor, would confront governments throughout history. The solutions developed along the Nile became part of humanity's broader political inheritance. Writing played an equally important role. The development of the hieroglyphic script allowed information to be preserved across generations. Administrative records, religious texts, historical inscriptions, literature, and legal documents created an enduring written tradition. Although hieroglyphs themselves eventually disappeared from common use, the principles they embodied, the preservation of knowledge through writing, remain one of the foundations of civilization. The Egyptian contribution to architecture also continues to inspire admiration. The pyramids remain among the most recognizable structures on Earth. For more than 4,000 years, they have survived wars, invasions, political upheaval, and environmental change. Their scale still astonishes modern visitors. Yet, they represent only a fraction of Egypt's architectural legacy. Temples such as Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, Edfu, and Philae demonstrate levels of planning, engineering, and artistic achievement that continue to attract scholars and travelers alike. These monuments remind us that ancient societies were capable of extraordinary accomplishments, using tools and technologies often regarded as simple by modern standards. Religion formed another important aspect of Egypt's legacy. The spiritual traditions of ancient Egypt shaped the lives of countless individuals over thousands of years. Beliefs concerning divine order, the afterlife, morality, judgment, and sacred kingship influenced not only Egyptian society, but also neighboring cultures. The worship of Isis spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Egyptian religious imagery appeared in distant lands. Concepts developed within Egyptian theology entered broader conversations about humanity's relationship with the divine. At the same time, historians recognize that Egyptian religion evolved continuously. It was never a static system. Gods rose and declined in prominence. Rituals changed. New ideas emerged. Ancient Egyptians themselves adapted their beliefs to the changing circumstances. This flexibility helps explain why their religious traditions endured for so long. The study of death and the afterlife remains one of Egypt's most famous contributions to human history. Mummies, tombs, funerary texts, and burial practices continue to capture public imagination. Yet these customs reflected deeper concerns shared by people throughout history. Ancient Egyptians asked questions that remain familiar today. What happens after death? How should a life be judged? What responsibilities do individuals owe to their communities? How can memory survive the passage of time? Their answers were uniquely Egyptian, but the questions themselves are universal. Art provides another window into the civilization's enduring influence. Egyptian sculpture, painting, jewelry, furniture, and decorative arts display a remarkable consistency across centuries. Artists developed visual conventions that communicated meaning clearly and effectively. Their works served religious, political, and social purposes while achieving levels of craftsmanship that remain impressive today. Modern museums around the world preserve examples of these achievements. Visitors continue to encounter faces, objects, and scenes created thousands of years ago. The survival of such works creates a sense of connection between distant generations. We are able to look upon the products of ancient hands and recognize familiar expressions of creativity, skill, and the human experience. Ancient Egypt also played an important role in the history of science and medicine. Egyptian physicians recorded observations about injuries and illnesses. Surveyors measured land following annual floods. Architects applied sophisticated principles of geometry and planning. Astronomical observations informed calendars and religious practices. Their knowledge was not identical to modern science, nor should it be judged according to modern standards. Yet it represented serious efforts to understand and organize the world. Many later societies built upon foundations established by earlier civilizations, including Egypt. The rediscovery of ancient Egypt transformed modern scholarship as well. The decipherment of hieroglyphs opened an entirely new field of study. Historians gained access to voices that had been silent for centuries. Archaeology evolved in response to the challenges and opportunities presented by Egypt's rich material record. Methods developed there influenced research around the world. Today, Egyptology remains one of the most active and visible areas of historical scholarship. New discoveries continue to reshape understanding. Burial chambers are uncovered, texts are translated, ancient settlements are excavated. Technologies such as DNA analysis, remote sensing, and digital imaging reveal information unavailable to earlier generations. The story of ancient Egypt is therefore not finished. Each generation asks new questions. Each discovery adds detail to the broader picture. Many mysteries remain unsolved. Scholars continue debating aspects of state formation, religion, social structure, economics, and political history. The existence of uncertainty is not a weakness. It is a reminder that history is an ongoing process of investigation and interpretation. Modern understanding of Egypt differs significantly from older stereotypes. For many years, public interest focused almost exclusively on pyramids, mummies, treasure, and famous rulers. Those subjects remain important, but contemporary scholarship seeks a fuller picture. The history of Egypt includes farmers and fishermen, merchants and craftsmen, scribes and laborers, priests and soldiers, women and children whose names never appear in royal inscriptions. Their lives formed the foundation upon which Egyptian civilization rested. Without them, the monuments could never have been built. Without them, the kingdom could never have functioned. Without them, the civilization itself would not have endured. Perhaps that is one of the most valuable lessons offered by ancient Egypt. The pyramids dominate the landscape because they survived, yet they represent only a small part of the civilization's story. Behind every monument stood countless individuals whose labor, knowledge, and cooperation made such achievements possible. Ancient Egypt reminds us that civilizations are collective creations. They emerge through the efforts of generations. They evolve, adapt, flourish, and sometimes decline. Even the most powerful kingdoms eventually change. The pharaohs believed that their monuments would preserve memory forever, and in many respects they succeeded. Thousands of years later, the names of Narmer, Djoser, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Ramesses, and Cleopatra remain known throughout the world. Yet perhaps the greater achievement lies elsewhere. Ancient Egypt preserved an extraordinary record of human experiences across more than 3 millennia. Its history allows us to observe the development of government, religion, technology, art, trade, and society over a span of time few civilizations can match. Through that record, we gain perspective on our own place in history. The lost world of ancient Egypt is no longer truly lost. Its cities have been excavated, its language has been deciphered, its monuments have been studied, and its people have been remembered. The Nile River still flows northward toward the Mediterranean, just as it did when the first farmers settled along its banks thousands of years ago. The pyramids still cast their shadows across the desert. The temples still stand beneath the Egyptian sky. And the story of ancient Egypt, one of humanity's longest, richest, and most enduring civilizations, continues to be told.